So I'm going to be talking about how we can achieve a good life for animals through breeding decisions and legislation. A lot of this from a UK perspective, but I've tried to bring in international perspectives too. So to start with, I think it is worth us considering, when do concerns for an animal's welfare begin? Commonly in the animal welfare community, we would be thinking that perhaps starts at birth, or maybe just soon before, with the lived experience of sentient animals being the central focus for those of us that are seeking to improve animal welfare and achieve a good life for animals. But before that, so events that precede birth, and even when we think of human decision making that precedes even conception, there are potentially key events that lead to an animal's future welfare and set that blueprint for that animal's future life. And of course, their ability to achieve a good life. I've obviously intentionally picked a brachycephalic breed here with bulldogs, where we know that much of their life is very much dependent upon human intervention from even the earlier stages of conception. So I think breeding, as we can see here, is more than just the cute puppies that we end up with at the end. So when we think about considering assessing welfare, we know that within kind of animal welfare science, historically, there'd been a big focus on animal welfare input. So what do we provide a dog in this case with? And lots of the other talks at this conference today and yesterday will have covered some of these areas, including things like how does training affect a dog's welfare, how, as Heather's just shown with veterinary care from start to the end of life, impact a dog's welfare and their ability to achieve a good life. But one other element is, of course, their genetics. This is something that's very heavily considered within production animal sciences, but is sometimes neglected as a potential input for our companion animals, despite it being potentially so important for their entire life. And in terms of genetics, we know dogs are incredibly genetic diverse. So we have huge diversity both between breeds, but also within them. That might be to do with their conformation, or it could be to do with other genetic characteristics. And the selective breeding of companion animals is a really powerful tool that can do great good. So, for example, we can use our modern knowledge of molecular genetics to select away from inherited disorders that we know of. And of course, we can select potentially for good temperaments that are compatible with a dog's ultimate role, of which for many dogs across the globe is as a companion. But we also know that this can go wrong. Selective breeding has got the power to cause great harms to animals' welfare, particularly when it's anthropocentrically driven. So it's driven by our own human wants. Would be reluctant to say needs, but our wants. So, for example, selecting for aesthetic traits that are appealing to humans but could be directly damaging to an animal's health. The impact of breeding in the companion animal welfare sphere has really received unprecedented attention over the past decade, in particular, following a number of high-profile events that question some of the practices that have led to and then perpetuated the hundreds of breeds of companion animal that are bred globally, particularly dogs, although there is increasing focus on cats, rabbits, and other small companion animals, thankfully. Some of these events were, as said, in the UK, so Pedigree Dogs Exposed was a primetime TV programme back in 2008, which I very much thank for my own career, given that that led to the funding of my PhD the following year and the path I've continued. Led to many inquiries, including the RSPCA, leading a major inquiry in 2009, an associate parliamentary group for animal welfare inquiry, and then finally an independent inquiry into dog breeding. We've also seen, of course, in the Southern Hemisphere, similar events and focus, including the Love is Blind campaign. And in the UK, we've more recently had the hashtag Breed to Breathe campaign. So we're seeing this more and more in the public sphere. And as I just said, with my own career, scientific interest has correspondingly peaked, and we know more than ever about the impact of selective breeding on companion animals. But unfortunately, much of this research paints quite a grim picture of the impact of humans playing God with their selection decisions. A systematic review back in 2009 by my good friend Lucy Asher and colleagues at the Royal Veterinary College revealed that almost 400 diseases of the domestic dog had some form of inherited component, of which almost a fifth were directly related to the body shape that we had been selectively breeding dogs for. In one of those reviews I mentioned earlier, the independent inquiry by the late Professor Sir Patrick Bateson, and it was noted that lots of our knowledge about predispositions in dogs was lacking, partly due to poor or patchy prevalence data. This led to my good colleague Dan O'Neill at RBC setting up with other epidemiologists this Vet Compass system, which has now made it across the world, including Australia, North America, and other parts of Europe. In the UK, nearly a third of our UK clinics contribute to this system, which has been a really powerful epidemiological tool to understand predispositions and also protections against disease in our companion animal breeds. Unfortunately, for some types of dog, this has again shown a really quite alarming picture. For flat-faced breeds, as I said, that Heather's already highlighted in her talk, we know that they are riddled with problems from head to tail. I don't think it's too dramatic to say that when we see the degree and severity of problems that these dogs face, and particularly when we reflect on the fact that most of these disorders have a conformational aspect, so are either caused or exacerbated by the body shape that we select for. The burden of genetic ill health is then sadly often compounded by a high demand for pedigree and designer dogs, resulting in compromised breeding practices from unscrupulous breeders looking to cash in on this burgeoning market without obviously regard for the individual canine's welfare. And the selection decisions of such breeders, or indeed complete lack of, beyond mating dogs of the desired type, in combination with poor early life environment and experiences, can set these young animals up for future behavioural and health problems, again putting further hurdles in the way of them being able to achieve this elusive good life. And demand during the pandemic has peaked in several countries. So my team at RVC explored the UK pandemic puppy phenomenon and found that the reasons why and the way that people have been buying puppies during 2020 compared to the same phase of 2019 has changed significantly, with some of the worst elements of puppy buying, including buying pups without seeing their mum or the environment that they were raised in, becoming more and more commonplace as it's replaced with an almost click and collect culture of acquiring puppies very rapidly. And in a Google Trends analysis from the University of Nottingham, searches for puppies in several countries, including the UK and Australia, have similarly increased across the globe. So with this somewhat grim picture of the way that we select for dogs and the way that we acquire them being such hurdles to achieving a good life, what can we do to improve these dogs' chances of achieving a good life through their breeding? So there are good things here. So this isn't going to be a complete doom-mongering talk. So research on genetic health in dogs has provided welfare and health conscious breeders with a real plethora of tools at their disposal to improve the chances of litters that they breed experiencing good health and welfare. Collaborations between veterinary bodies, dog registration bodies, vets and scientists has led to tests for breeding dogs, screening for disorders including eye, heart, orthopedic, neurological and respiratory diseases. The UK Kennel Club has developed a free online tool called Mate Select, which houses many of these test results, as well as other useful tools like estimated breeding values for complex traits like hip and elbow dysplasia, the inbreeding coefficient of parents and their future proposed offspring. And this tool has been again used across the globe. We can see from this map that it's largely in Europe and the US, but we can see that it has been used in New Zealand too. And also, as I alluded to earlier, recent advances in canine molecular genetics has provided the groundwork for developing genetic tests for many canine inherited diseases, with DNA tests safe and easy to perform for breeders and only required once in a dog's lifetime compared to phenotypic screening. One success story for this has been a really severe form of epilepsy that's particularly in the miniature wirehead dachshund known as Lafora disease, which has been dramatically reduced in prevalence in the UK, including dogs that are affected, but also the amount of dogs that carry the risk alleles. And again, we can see from this publication here, which is a collaboration between geneticists, neurologists, and several authors of this paper being dog breeders. So if we can engage dog breeders, good things can happen. We know, of course, that many inherited disorders in dogs have a complex multifactorial inheritance with more than one gene involved in their development, often alongside complex and sometimes unknown environmental factors. One of the kind of poster boys of this is hip dysplasia, which I mentioned already. And as such, further testing of prospective breeding dogs is needed at this phenotypic level before breeding decisions should be made. And again, for tests such as this, genetic tests have tried to be developed but have unfortunately haven't been fruitful. So it's this combination of different types of tests for breeds that are predisposed to these conditions. As I mentioned earlier around flat-faced dogs, what about those disorders that are related to a dog's body shape? Research that quantitatively links body shape with disease has been relatively sparse until recently, but has been conducted for some key conformation-related disorders, including brachycephalic obstructive airway syndrome in flat-faced breeds. And this graph, which was from my baby PhD, a good old decade ago now, represents the strong relationship between conformation and the risk of obstructive airway syndrome in dogs, with the x-axis showing relative muzzle length from a completely absent muzzle through to around the muzzle length of a Rottweiler, and the y-axis represents the probability of obstructive airway syndrome from 0 through to 1. And we can see that as muzzle length reduces, the risk of this severe lifelong disorder increases almost exponentially. And when we view this video from my colleague Claire Rusbridge, we can see that it's almost no surprise really that how dramatically deformed the important structures within the mouth and the nasopharynx, not to mention the cranium and the brain, become, and how little space remains in the brachycephalic skull. So from my work in this area, I propose this concept of healthy conformational limits. So these are thresholds to health beyond which the risk of poor health becomes unacceptably high. And we can see here that if we set that limit, so for example, of a craniofacial ratio of 0.1, which is average for a pug, that many breeds would still be at high risk of airway obstruction. If we were a bit tighter and we say we'll go down to 0.2, the highest risks are eliminated. But perhaps we want to move beyond this and instead think about ruling out breeds that have craniofacial ratio of perhaps 0.3, 0.4 or beyond. Given that selection for extreme body shapes in dogs is driven by human desires for canine aesthetics, research findings that advocate for breeding towards more moderate morphologies have been largely rejected by the dog breeding community. And although I'm sure that many people in this audience would think that this moderate so-called retro pug on the right looks preferable to the completely flat-faced dog on the left, this look has been entirely rejected by the influential showing communities internationally, who've instead opted to use screening programs to select away from the worst breathers whilst retaining this high-risk phenotype, which unfortunately can still lead to many other eye, skin, dental and neurological conditions. And we've begun to understand this a little bit more over the last 10 years. So one of my research themes has been around understanding the ownership of brachycephalic breeds. And I don't think it's too controversial now, given that we have evidence to suggest that owners of such breeds often prioritise the appearance of their breed over their health, that they normalise signs of ill health in their dog, as Heather alluded to, that they often deflect breed-related health problems onto other members of their breed, so a lot of scapegoating, and instead overestimate the health of their own dog compared to objective veterinary assessments, that they often recommend pathological traits, so things like low exercise tolerance instead being characterised as lazy or low exercise needs, and are strongly emotionally bonded to their dog, which is a huge barrier to the changing of the breeding of these high-risk dogs because of the influence of that upon processes of cognitive dissonance and how incredibly attached dogs are to their own dog, breeders are to their own dog, but also to their breed more widely. Despite these challenges, the results of the conformational research in dogs that I mentioned has been included in international animal breeding laws to set these healthy conformational limits, demonstrating that legislative approaches may sometimes be needed to tackle the most intractable health and welfare problems in dogs. So this is in the Netherlands, where they now don't allow the breeding of dogs with a craniofacial ratio of 0.3 or below. And for any dog who has a craniofacial ratio of 0.5 or below, there are increased measures that they have to meet to be allowed to breed from those individuals. I think internationally, the growing frustration over the slow pace of change in the breeding of brachycephalic, but indeed other extreme breeds in the UK and internationally, that's been combined with this unabated rise in the popularity of some of these breeds. Legislative approaches are increasingly being considered and being promoted by international animal welfare campaigners. And within such legislation, it's essential that the offspring are explicitly protected. This has recently been seen in the updated UK legislation for breeding, that we can see that the detrimental effect on the offspring is also included here. At present, we haven't had a test case to actually see whether this legislation can be effectively implemented to improve or perhaps even stop the breeding of brachycephalic animals. As I mentioned earlier, using research to improve breeding has provided many, many practical tools for international kennel clubs to promote to their registered breeders. But what about those breeders who operate entirely outside of those systems? Large-scale commercial breeding, sometimes known as puppy mills or puppy farms, as well as what we might think of as backyard or hobby breeders, often raise welfare concerns for the breeding dog and for the puppy's welfare. Breeder licensing has been implemented in several countries across the world, including the UK, where in the UK, all breeders who breed commercially, in the UK's case, they sell puppies that are intended to make a profit or sell 3 or more litters per year, must be licensed. And licensing allows for inspection of a breeder's premises to assess against basic standards for dogs, including suitable accommodation, diet, drink and bedding, provision of regular exercise, safe and comfortable transportation, and protection from pain, injury and disease, broadly through, for example, limiting the number of litters and C-sections that a bitch can undergo and promoting the use of preventative health care. Breeder licensing also incorporates the advertising of puppies, which is a booming online trade, further normalised by the pandemic, as I mentioned before. And the law stipulates that licence numbers should be displayed in any advertising of puppies alongside the name of their local licensing authority, a recognisable photo of the puppy and its age. And again, the photo element is to avoid this whole concept in the UK known as pet fishing. So where pets that might not actually be the one that is being sold are advertised, and then the buyer ends up with a completely different individual. This improves the advertising standards, obviously, by having these different restrictions included, but also potentially improves prospective owner awareness of these regulations. But unfortunately, it still lacks enforcement in the UK and has much room for improvement, which again could be aided and is being aided by working with online puppy selling sites, the largest in the UK being Pets for Homes. So almost to finish, going beyond basic licensing, the UK has recently introduced a ban on third-party sale of puppies. So a breeder must now directly sell to new owners, and purchasers must be allowed to see puppies with their mother and their litter mates. We still found in our pandemic puppy work that 1 in 4 puppies in the UK after this legislation were still being bought without seeing their mum in 2020, and that was up from 1 in 6 in 2019. So raising awareness with puppy buyers as well as breeders, I think, is a key to helping them recognise, see these red flags for breeders that are working outside of the law, and encourage them to walk away from those that are. So just to conclude, breeding, I feel, sets a really important blueprint for a dog's lifelong health and welfare. Being born into a poorly bred body can have severe welfare consequences and have huge barriers to dogs being able to achieve a good life. Protecting canine welfare via improved breeding, as I've hopefully alluded to today, is a really complex process that involves many different stakeholders, including breeders themselves, but also owners, animal welfare organisations and governments. Science, as we've seen, can offer many tools to engaged breeders to improve their selection practices with the aim of achieving a good life. But engagement with these tools really requires buy-in from breeders, but also demand from prospective owners. So they actually want dogs that are bred to their standards, so things that are important to owners for their dog's future welfare. In many cases at the moment, both are missing. So we're not getting the buy-in from owners or the awareness and demand from breeders. And this is where legislative approaches are potentially required, where the breeders and the public aren't advocating in the best interests of the breeding dogs and their puppies. So hopefully that was of interest. I'd love to take any questions and say thank you to everybody who I've worked with on this. And of course, a shout out to our lovely book, which hopefully will be of interest and has authors from the Northern and Southern Hemisphere.
Thank you so much, Rowena. That was such a brilliant presentation. Lots of questions have come in. I just want to start by saying that video around muzzle length was absolutely excellent. And a key
Very
thing,
useful, hey?
Yeah, a key thing we need to do is to change what dog owners want, clearly. Very interested in this Netherlands law. Fantastic. We need more of this internationally. And just a question on that, and then we'll have other questions that we'll pass over to you that we'll be able to feed back. But how do we, in terms of this Dutch legislation, how is it actually enforced? And also, what happens if pups are born with their snouts being too short? And what happens? What actually happens? What is the enforcement regime there?
So this has literally just started in the last year in the Netherlands. There is a fantastic Dutch vet, Marian van Hagen, who has been integral to this legislation coming about and it being enforced. So breeders have already been fined for being found to have bred puppies, so with monetary fines. I need to check to see what the maximum is, but I think it's relatively high. There is the challenge, of course, that also some breeders in the Netherlands who want to continue breeding to their previous standards are now registering their puppies in the countries surrounding the Netherlands, given that it has a few. So there is always going to be ways to get around these laws. But I think it's a really interesting step change, given that we've often advocated for this partnership approach towards improving breeding. So in the UK, we have the Brachycephalic Working Group, which I'm a part of, which is a really heady mix of breeders, veterinary organisations, animal welfare organisations. They're the most challenging meetings I've probably ever attended in my career in terms of diplomacy, but they have been trying to get these different parties to work together. The downside of which is the speed of change is very much hampered because we're talking about compromises on both sides, where obviously advocating for a legislative approach potentially circumvents that, which is why the legislation came about in the Netherlands. But we're watching very closely there. Also of interest from a legislative approach is the Norwegian Kennel Club is currently being sued by their equivalent of the RSPCA, and several breeders out there are also being sued of English Bulldogs and Cavalier King Charles Spaniels. That is next month, the legal case there. So I think what happens there could have ramifications across the globe. So very current and very worrying, but I think I'm holding my breath.
Yeah, really, really interesting. And thank you very much for staying up late and presenting to us. We really appreciate it. So thank you very much, Rowena.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.